Now, what was the problem that Paul had there in chapter 2? The problem he had there is that he was expecting to find Titus, and Titus wasn't there, so he had no comfort in his spirit, and he chose not to go forward with this open opportunity that he had to preach. Now, look at how things change here. Look at chapter 7, verse 6. Nevertheless, God that comforted those, notice, that are what? Cast down. You know, you read that, and doesn't it sound a little bit like Paul's depressed? Paul's countenance is what? Low. It says that he's cast down. Now notice what happens. Verse 6, nevertheless, God that comforted those that are cast down, comforted us, how? By the coming of who? Titus. So what does that tell you then about Paul's relationship with Titus? Paul has a very close relationship with Titus, and he values him. So much so that the indication, if you put the verses together here, is that Paul was in a state of, I don't want to say deep depression, but he was at least melancholy and not right in his spirit because Titus wasn't there, and the coming of Titus brought what to Paul? Comfort to him. Come with me to chapter 8. Look at verse 1. Chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed unto the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction the abundance of their joy and of their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. For their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon for the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Verse 5, and this they did not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God. Notice verse 6, insomuch that we desired who? Titus, that he had begun, so would also finish in you the same grace also. My point to you is this: does Paul send Titus on a missionary errand here for him to go down to the churches of Macedonia and ultimately Corinth to collect this offering? Look, drop down, same chapter, drop down to verse 16. But thanks be to God, which putteth the same earnest care into the heart of who? Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, and being more forward of his own accord, he went unto you. So here's a guy, Titus. If you want to understand who Titus is one of Paul's fellow laborers. He is one of Paul's co-laborers. In the early chapters of the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul expects to find him in Troas and doesn't find him. And he has great unrest within his spirit over not finding Titus. And it's not till later on when Titus comes that it brings comfort to the heart of Paul. And then you also see here Paul sending Titus out to aid him on various errands for the work of the ministry. So, Titus was sent by Paul to deal with serious irregularities in the church at Corinth. That's what all that stuff in chapter 8 is about. And particularly with their delinquency as the stewards of the material wealth God had entrusted to them. Now come with me also to Galatians chapter 2. The other prominent place that you're going to see Titus mention is what Paul has to say here in Galatians chapter 2 in relationship to the Jerusalem Council. Now, not to get in, we just finished our study this morning in the book of Galatians in the Sunday morning Sunday school hour. And not to get into too much detail on this, what happened was when the book of Galatians is written to the churches of Galatia. Galatia was a region located in modern-day Asia Minor or Turkey, where on his first missionary journey, Paul went out and established local churches in these areas. Okay, so he goes out and establishes local churches in these areas, all through the regions of Galatia. And after he leaves those churches, there are people that come in after Paul, called the Judaizers, that are teaching them that except they be circumcised after the manner of Moses, they cannot be saved. And they're trying to put these believers who had been saved by grace through faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ back under the bondage of the law. So Paul writes the book of Galatians to the Galatians to correct them in their acceptance of this incorrect doctrine. And one of the things that happens is a big council is going to meet in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. And Titus is going to be taken up there with Paul. Look at Galatians 2, verse 1. Notice, Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. Now again, that tells you that Titus is with Paul all through the book of Acts at various places as he's on his missionary journeys, even though he's never mentioned in the text of the book of Acts. Verse 2, and I went up by revelation and communicated unto them the gospel, which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which are of reputation, lest by any means I should run, or had run in vain. Look at verse 3, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be what? So Titus accompanies Paul as a Gentile representative to the Jerusalem council, where Paul uses Titus as an example to defend the Gentile liberty from the law, and specifically from circumcision. So Titus is with Paul a lot. That's my point. Paul values Titus's partnership in the ministry. That's who he's writing to. So the obvious implication here is that Titus was clearly someone who was dear to the heart of the Apostle Paul. Now, so that's the writer and the reader, specifically. Let's look for a little bit, if we could, at, if this will work. Will you advance that, Joel? At the date. Come with me back to Titus chapter 1. Titus chapter 1. Look at verse 5. Titus chapter 1, verse 5. It says, for this cause, well, let me back up. So verse 1 tells you who the writer is. It's Paul. Verse 4 tells you who the book is written to. It's written to Titus. And verse 5 gives us some insight into the dating of the book. Notice what it says. For this cause I left thee where? Now, notice what it says. For this cause I left thee where? So if Paul's going to leave him in Crete, then the obvious implication is that Titus and Paul had been together at some point where? On Crete. Okay? Now you say, well, what does that have to do with the date? Well, it actually has a lot to do with it, as I'll demonstrate to you here as we go through this. Okay? Crete, just so you know, is an island in the Mediterranean Sea off the north coast of Africa. And that's why I include the map here. Crete is right here. Okay? North African coast would be down in here. All this stuff is in the Mediterranean. This would be, obviously, Greece and the Balkan Peninsula up in here. But this is the island that that's where Titus is at when Paul addresses this epistle to him. He's located on the island of Crete. All right? The island of Crete is 156 miles long, not very big, and about 30 miles wide at its widest point. Now, when I was growing up, I don't know if this is what this is going to do in terms of dating me. When I was growing up, we used to call the dorks in school Cretans. Remember, any of you know that one? None of you used the term Cretan? No? No one used Cretan. Wow. That was kind of like the term for, the brain kids, the kids that, we might call them the nerds. I don't know but a Cretan was also a term that was used at my high school to describe somebody who basically was annoying or nerdy or someone that you really didn't want to hang out with too much. And I know it's not a real nice term, but it comes out of the Bible, if you didn't know that. I want to show that to you. Come with me. The Cretans, look at chapter 1, look at verse 12. Look at what Paul says about this. So Titus is left here on the island of Crete. Verse 12, of one of themselves, even a prophet of their own said, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. Notice what Paul says. This witness is true. What kind of people were the Cretans? Well, they were what? Liars, evil beasts, and what? Slow bellies. So are these guys, the kind of people that you typically want to go hang out with? Okay? So the term Cretan, to act the Cretan, or the term Cretan, becomes accepted into the language of the first century as an idiom to refer to someone who's a liar. Okay? And this is the type of people that Titus is going to be dealing with as he's left on the island of Crete by the Apostle Paul to set some things in order. Okay? Now that's just a little bit of information for you to consider, but look if you would at Acts chapter 2. Come with me to Acts chapter 2.